In the small Midwestern town of Briar Hollow, Ohio, the pastor was one of the most trusted men in the community. People didn't usually refer to him by his full name. Most simply called him Pastor. That alone spoke volumes. In a town where trust was earned slowly and lost forever, he had become a figure people leaned on during their weakest moments. Sunday mornings in Briar Hollow followed a familiar routine. Families dressed neatly. Cars lined the gravel parking lot near the old church building that had stood for decades. Inside, sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting soft colors across wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshipers. At the center of it all stood Pastor Elijah Crow. He wasn't loud. He didn't shout or pace the pulpit like some preachers did. Instead, he spoke calmly, deliberately, with a confidence that made people feel safe. When he talked about sin, it sounded like concern, not judgment. When he spoke of redemption, it felt personal, like he was speaking directly to each person in the room. God does his greatest work in silence, he often said. Not everything needs to be seen to be real. The congregation admired that about him. Elijah Crow had arrived in Briar Hollow 11 years earlier, at a time when the church was struggling. Attendance was low. Donations barely covered expenses. The previous pastor had left suddenly, citing personal matters, and few questions were asked. Elijah filled the gap effortlessly. Within 2 years, attendance surged. People who hadn't attended church in years began returning. New families moved to town and quickly found their way into the pews. Counseling appointments were booked weeks in advance. The church became the emotional center of Briar Hollow. People said Elijah had a gift. He listens like he actually cares, one woman said. He remembers everything you tell him, another added. And he did. Elijah listened carefully, not just to words, but to pauses, hesitations, emotional reactions. He learned what people feared, what they regretted, and what they would do anything to keep hidden. He encouraged private counseling sessions, often late in the evening. Some struggles are too delicate for daylight, he would say. Darkness allows honesty. No one questioned it. After all, he was a pastor. Outside the church, Elijah lived quietly. He occupied a modest 2-story house on the edge of town. No wife, no children, no visible social life. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, someone who waved but rarely stopped to chat. His lights were often on late at night. Inside, his home office looked ordinary at first glance. Bookshelves lined with Bibles and theology texts, framed certificates on the wall, a simple wooden desk. But beneath a loose floorboard, hidden under a rug, Elijah kept a second phone. This phone never rang during the day. It was used only at night. No contacts were saved. Messages were short and quickly deleted. Numbers were rotated regularly. Locations were never repeated. Elijah was careful. He drove miles away from Briar Hollow to meet people, places where no one would expect to see a pastor. Abandoned motels along the highway, empty parking garages, isolated cabins rented under false names, and always after dark. To Elijah, night offered something the day did not: control. Over time, his sermons began to change subtly. He spoke more about obedience, about authority, about how sometimes God chose certain people to lead others through uncomfortable paths. Not all pain is punishment, he preached once. Some pain is correction. The congregation nodded. They didn't know those words reflected his private beliefs. Elijah had come to see himself not just as a spiritual guide, but as an instrument of discipline. He believed people were flawed, weak, easily corrupted, and that fear was sometimes the only way to keep them aligned. He told himself it was necessary. At first, his actions stayed within psychological boundaries: emotional manipulation, isolation, making people dependent on his approval, encouraging secrecy under the guise of spiritual protection. Then, those boundaries shifted. Private sessions grew longer, physical proximity increased, commands replaced suggestions, resistance was framed as disobedience not to him, but to God. And when someone hesitated, Elijah reminded them of what they had confessed, their sins, their mistakes, their shame. "You don't want to damage your testimony," he would say quietly. Some complied. Some disappeared from the church without explanation. A few left town altogether. People noticed, but explained it away. "Not everyone can handle deep truth," Elijah said when asked. "Some people walk away when faith gets uncomfortable." No one challenged him. Why would they? By day, Elijah Crow preached salvation beneath stained glass and open Bibles. By night, he operated in secrecy, manipulation, and fear. And in Briar Hollow, no one yet realized that the man they trusted most was slowly becoming the town's darkest secret. Not yet. Hannah Brooks did not walk into the church looking for answers. She walked in because she had run out of places to go. At 32, her life looked stable from the outside. She had a job at a local insurance office. She paid her bills on time. She showed up to work every morning. But behind that routine was a quiet collapse that no one saw. Her marriage had ended suddenly and painfully. Years of unresolved arguments finally exploded into one decision she never thought she'd face: divorce. The house they once shared was sold. Friends picked sides. Phone calls stopped coming in. 3 months later, her father died. A stroke. No warning. One moment he was complaining about his knee, the next he was gone. Hannah didn't make it to the hospital in time. Grief settled into her life slowly, then all at once. She stopped sleeping. She stopped cooking. Some nights she sat on her apartment floor in the dark, staring at nothing, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. A coworker noticed the change. "You ever think about going back to church?" the woman asked one afternoon, gently. Hannah hadn't. Not seriously. She'd grown up attending occasionally, but faith had never been central to her life. Still, that Sunday morning, with nothing else to hold on to, she went. She arrived late and slipped into a seat near the back, hoping to leave unnoticed. But the pastor noticed her. He always did. After the service, he approached her quietly, not with enthusiasm or pressure, but with a calm that felt disarming. "You don't look lost," he said. "You look tired." Something about that made Hannah's eyes fill with tears. He didn't push, he didn't pry. He simply invited her to talk if she ever wanted to, gave his card, told her there was no obligation. Hannah called him 2 days later. The first counseling session felt safe. He listened more than he spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. When she cried, he let the silence stretch instead of rushing to fill it. "You've been strong for too long," he said. "That kind of strength eventually breaks." She felt seen. Over the next few weeks, Hannah returned again and again. She began attending services regularly. She sat closer to the front. She volunteered to help clean after events. People greeted her warmly. For the first time in months, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Privately, the pastor became a constant presence in her life. Their meetings grew longer. Sometimes they extended late into the evening. He said grief often surfaced at night when distractions faded.
"Darkness forces honesty," he told her. He asked questions that felt deeply personal, but framed them as necessary. "What do you regret most about your marriage? Where do you feel the most guilt? What parts of yourself do you hide from everyone else?" Hannah answered because she believed honesty was the path to healing. Slowly, the tone changed. He began speaking less about God and more about obedience, about trust, about how healing required surrender. "You have to let go of control," he told her. "That's where people struggle." The first moment that made her uncomfortable was small. During a prayer, his hand stayed on her shoulder longer than expected. She noticed but dismissed it. Pastors touched people during prayer. That was normal.
The next time, his hand moved to her back. She felt her body tense. He didn't acknowledge it. After that, the meetings became more private. Doors closed, phones silenced. He insisted confidentiality was critical. People misunderstand spiritual work, he said. They project their own brokenness onto it. One night, during what he described as an urgent counseling session, he locked the door behind her. He said nothing at first. He prayed aloud, slowly, intently. Then his voice changed, lower, more deliberate. He spoke about vulnerability, about submission, about how fear was often a sign of spiritual resistance. When she pulled away, he stopped praying. "Do you trust God?" he asked. Hannah hesitated, confused. "Yes," she said quietly. "Then trust the process," he replied. That night haunted her. She went home shaken, her mind replaying every moment. She told herself she was overreacting, that grief was distorting her perception, that she didn't want to falsely accuse a man who had helped her so much. When she skipped the next service, he noticed immediately. Messages followed, then calls. When she didn't respond, he came to her apartment. He stood at the door, calm and concerned. "I was worried," he said. "Isolation is dangerous when you're vulnerable." Against her instincts, she let him in. From that point on, his tone shifted completely. He criticized her friends, suggested her coworkers didn't have her best interests at heart, said her family didn't understand her spiritual growth. "They don't see what I see," he told her. When she finally expressed discomfort, his kindness disappeared. "You don't want to create confusion," he said quietly. "People talk, stories get twisted." Then he reminded her of what she had shared, her secrets, her regrets, her shame. "Think carefully before you speak," he warned. Hannah realized then that what she thought was support had become control. Over the next few months, she noticed others vanishing from the congregation. Faces she recognized simply stopped appearing. When she asked about them, she received vague answers. They moved on. They weren't ready for deep commitment. One evening, she received a message from a woman she barely knew. "Did he ever make you uncomfortable?" the message read. "I don't know who else to ask." Hannah stared at her phone for a long time. Then she typed one word: "Yes." That moment changed everything. Hannah began saving messages, recording calls, keeping notes. She didn't know what she would do with them, but she knew she might need them. When she tried to cut off contact entirely, the pastor's response was cold. "You won't be believed, and you'll destroy more than just yourself." Hannah didn't reply. She simply waited. And somewhere in Briar Hollow, questions were beginning to surface, quietly, carefully. The darkness was no longer completely hidden. Detective Marcus Hale had learned early in his career that evil rarely announces itself. It hides in plain sight, often behind trust, authority, and familiarity. Briar Hollow, a quiet Midwestern town, had never seen much serious crime. Calls usually involved petty disputes, occasional theft, or the rare domestic incident. Violent crime was almost non-existent. So when the first missing person report came in, it was treated as routine. A young woman who hadn't been seen for days, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest foul play. But Marcus noticed details others overlooked. Both the first and second missing women had recently begun attending the same pastor's services. Both had requested private counseling sessions with him. Both had withdrawn from friends and family around the same time. Patterns like this didn't happen by accident, and Marcus trusted his instincts. He requested background information on the pastor. Nothing criminal appeared. No arrests, no complaints. But there were gaps. Churches he had previously led had quietly closed. References were vague, relocations frequent. Something about his record didn't sit right. To better understand, Marcus attended a Sunday service.
He sat near the back, observing the pastor's interactions, calm, deliberate, perfectly controlled. He noticed how people leaned in, how they hung on every word. The pastor's gaze lingered just long enough to create connection and authority. After the service, Marcus watched him move through the congregation, checking in personally with people, drawing intimate details from strangers with ease. Trust came naturally to him, but Marcus saw how that trust could be weaponized. Hannah Brooks's story exemplified that. She had been a quiet, vulnerable woman, struggling with the aftermath of a divorce and the sudden death of her father. Her first encounters with the pastor were framed as guidance, comfort, and spiritual healing. She confided deeply personal thoughts, unaware that each revelation would later become a tool to control and manipulate her. Late-night counseling sessions, private meetings, and subtle coercion slowly isolated her from friends and family. Hannah's recollections became invaluable. When she came forward, she handed over screenshots, messages, notes, and a meticulous record of her interactions. Every question he asked, every touch she had once dismissed, every moment of fear she had internalized, all of it provided law enforcement with a roadmap. With Hannah's cooperation, the FBI began connecting the dots. Burner phones traced late-night communications, hotel receipts, and rental records placed the pastor in isolated locations far from town, often coinciding with the disappearances. Security footage from distant towns showed him fueling his car, entering hotels, or moving suspiciously late at night. Each piece of evidence corroborated witness accounts. Other survivors quietly came forward, emboldened by Hannah's courage. One by one, their experiences revealed a systematic pattern of manipulation, coercion, and abuse. Emotional abuse, isolation, and threats had been consistent, carefully orchestrated over years. Victims spoke of fear, shame, and confusion, how obedience was framed as faith and resistance as sin. The community that had once trusted him without question was now grappling with the reality that their shepherd had preyed on them. The investigation was painstaking. Every claim had to be verified, every location confirmed. Agents combed through digital evidence, cross-referenced hotel and gas station records, and tracked unusual travel patterns. One image from a surveillance camera showing a man matching the pastor's description late at night helped federal investigators narrow the search. Meanwhile, the pastor sensed the growing pressure. He canceled late-night sessions, altered routines, and deleted more messages than usual. During sermons, he began speaking of persecution and vigilance, framing suspicion as an attack on faith. But Marcus and the FBI were ahead. They had enough evidence to anticipate his moves. Finally, a routine traffic stop ended the pastor's freedom. 3 states away, he was driving under a false identity. He presented a fake license and registration. When officers questioned him, his calm, blank stare revealed nothing. No denial, no surprise, just silence. The arrest was executed carefully, with federal agents ready to take him into custody. Once handcuffed and seated in the vehicle, the man who had inspired trust, obedience, and fear was no longer a pastor. He was just a man facing the consequences of years of deception. Back in Briar Hollow, the news of his arrest spread quickly through the community. Families of victims, former congregants, and the town at large were stunned. Some struggled to reconcile the man they had revered with the criminal the authorities had revealed. Others felt a cautious relief, knowing that the source of years of manipulation and fear was finally gone. The trial followed, and the courtroom became a stage for the harrowing truth. Survivors, led by Hannah Brooks, recounted experiences that had once silenced them. They spoke of late-night counseling sessions, subtle coercion, emotional manipulation, and the fear that had kept them compliant for years. Each testimony now carried weight in the investigation and would later form the backbone of the trial. Hannah's meticulous records, combined with the corroborating stories of others, allowed investigators to connect multiple disappearances and abusive encounters to a single orchestrated pattern.
For Hannah, stepping forward was both terrifying and empowering. She had lived in fear for so long, second-guessing herself, doubting her instincts, and blaming herself for the pastor's manipulation. But in sharing her story, she became instrumental in exposing the truth. Each detail she provided helped law enforcement anticipate his moves, identify his methods, and protect future victims. Law enforcement and survivors worked together to reconstruct the pastor's behavior, how he exploited trust, isolated individuals, and manipulated vulnerable people under the guise of spiritual guidance. His crimes were not random, they were deliberate and systematic. And while his arrest didn't erase the trauma he inflicted, it provided a turning point, a moment where fear gave way to accountability. By the time the trial began, the scope of the pastor's actions was undeniable. Survivors were prepared to testify. Digital evidence and witness testimony painted a chilling picture of manipulation and abuse. The investigation and courage of witnesses like Hannah had turned what once seemed like isolated incidents into a clear pattern of criminal behavior. For the first time in years, the town, the victims, and law enforcement could see the full extent of the danger that had lurked behind the pulpit. The man who had inspired devotion, fear, and obedience was finally exposed. And through it all, the bravery of those who came forward proved that even the most carefully hidden crimes could be brought into the light. The arrest of Pastor Elijah Crow marked the beginning of the end for a man who once commanded trust and fear in equal measure. After months of careful investigation, combining witness testimonies, digital evidence, and diligent surveillance, law enforcement finally had him in custody. 3 states away, during what began as a routine traffic stop, officers pulled over a vehicle with an expired registration. When the driver presented a fake license, investigators immediately knew who they were dealing with. Crow did not resist. He didn't plead, argue, or attempt to justify his actions. He simply sat in the back of the vehicle, silent and unflinching, as if the weight of his years of deception had finally caught up with him. Back in Briar Hollow, news of his arrest spread quickly through the community. Families of victims, former congregants, and the town at large were stunned. Some struggled to reconcile the man they had revered with the criminal the authorities had revealed. Others felt a cautious relief, knowing that the source of years of manipulation and fear was finally gone. The trial followed, and the courtroom became a stage for the harrowing truth. Survivors, led by Hannah Brooks, recounted experiences that had once silenced them. They spoke of late-night counseling sessions, subtle coercion, emotional manipulation, and the fear that had kept them compliant for years. Each testimony painted a consistent picture of a man who had weaponized trust and authority for control. Digital evidence, burner phone records, hotel receipts, surveillance footage corroborated these accounts, illustrating a pattern that extended far beyond a single victim. The prosecution framed Crow not just as a manipulative pastor, but as a calculated predator, using faith and authority as tools to isolate and dominate vulnerable individuals. The defense attempted to argue misinterpretation, claiming charisma and influence had been mistaken for coercion, but the weight of the evidence, coupled with the consistency of survivor accounts, left little room for doubt. The jury, visibly disturbed by the depth of deception, returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on multiple counts, including coercion, sexual misconduct, and obstruction of justice. Sentencing was swift. Crow received life without the possibility of parole. In the courthouse, the silence that followed the pronouncement was heavy, an acknowledgement of the lives disrupted, the trust violated, and the fear endured. For the victims, it was both closure and a stark reminder that healing would take time. In the months following, survivors began reclaiming their lives. Counseling, support groups, and advocacy programs helped them navigate trauma, while awareness campaigns educated the wider community about the signs of manipulation within trusted institutions. Hannah, once silenced by fear, emerged as a voice of resilience, helping others understand that the courage to speak can be a powerful tool against abuse. Briar Hollow slowly began to recover. The church, once a beacon of faith, now stood empty, a symbol of the lessons learned and the vigilance required to protect the vulnerable. While the pastor's crimes left lasting scars, the community's resilience and the bravery of those who came forward ensured that his influence would never return. The story of Pastor Elijah Crow serves as a chilling reminder. Sometimes the greatest darkness can hide behind the most familiar faces. But with courage, persistence, and truth, even the most carefully hidden crimes can be brought into the light.